Me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Inflation has fallen by more than half. The Chancellor is cutting taxes. Rip Van Winkle has awoken after 35 years and thinks Nigel Lawson is still Chancellor. But is it as it seems? And the biggest breakthrough so far, Israel and Hamas will stop all fighting for a 4-day period, with hundreds of people to be released on both sides. Security experts are sceptical about how this could give Hamas the upper hand. Tomorrow's net migration figures may be more than already record numbers that we got last year. The UK is now taking on equal amounts, if not more, family members of those granted working visas. Surely the government needs to crack down on legal migration now, and quickly. It's more important numerically than the boats. Plus, was the plague racist? That's the view of some academics who recently claimed that a disproportionate number of black people died during the Great Plague in the 14th century. Is this a bizarre, politically motivated rewriting of history that Orwell's Ministry of Truth would be proud of? Or is it simply seeing our nation's past through a new, enlightened lens? State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by an excellent panel this evening. We have the exuberant historian and author, Dr. Tessa Dunlop, and the cantankerous former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a key part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's what we've all been waiting for, the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you and good evening to you. Well, we start this bulletin with some breaking news from the US-Canada border. All 4 international border crossings in western New York have been locked down following a major vehicle explosion. This happening within the last half hour at the Rainbow Bridge crossing near Niagara Falls. American media are reporting that 2 people have died. The FBI is investigating and has described the situation as very fluid. So, to recap, all 4 international border crossings between the US and Canada in the western New York Niagara area are closed. 2 people are dead. More on that as we get it. And to continue with some breaking news, that French media is reporting that 2 people have died after a migrant boat capsized off the French coast this morning. French and British maritime agencies were called in to reports of a boat in some difficulty about 8 miles from the port of Boulogne. That was at around 5 o'clock this morning. French officials are telling media 60 people were crammed on board the small boat. It then began sinking. So a second breaking news item there for you from French police, and we'll bring you more on that as well as we get it. Well, to continue with the main news of the day, a raft of tax cuts and benefits increases aimed at making 27 million people better off was announced by the Chancellor today in the biggest change outlined in his autumn statement today. Jeremy Hunt said national insurance will be cut from 12 to 10%. He also announced the triple lock on pensions will be maintained. That takes the state pension up by 8.5% to more than £220 a week. And he said taxes on alcohol will be frozen until August the 1st next year, meaning there is no increase in duty on beer, cider, wines or spirits. The mother of a 28-year-old woman shot in her home in Liverpool has called the killers monsters as they were jailed today for life for the murder. Ashley Dale was killed when James Witham forced his way into her home and opened fire with a machine gun. He and 3 other men were handed life sentences with minimum terms to serve of between 41 and 47 years. Witham and his co-defendants, Joseph Pearce, Niall Barry and Sean Zeiss, were all found guilty of murder and conspiracy to murder Miss Dale's partner. And the hometown of 4 teenage boys who died in North Wales has cancelled their switching on of the Christmas lights tonight out of respect from the families involved. Jevon Hurst, Harvey Owen, Wilf Fitchett and Hugo Morris had set off on a camping trip to Snowdonia. Their bodies were recovered yesterday after a car was found overturned and partially submerged in water. North Wales police say it appears to have been a tragic accident. And within the last 15 minutes, Israel's Prime Minister has said the Red Cross will be allowed to visit all remaining hostages in Gaza. It comes after an agreed 4-day pause in fighting, we believe starting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Full coverage right here, GB News. 50 hostages will be freed by the terror group in the morning in exchange for 150 Palestinians who are held in Israeli prisons. And here in the UK today, the new Foreign Secretary David Cameron has said the truce is a crucial step towards providing humanitarian relief in Gaza. As I said, we'll be bringing you full coverage of that right here, GB News. And lastly today, the Prime Minister and his wife welcomed South Korea's President and First Lady to number 10 Downing Street. Yoon Suk-yeol and Rishi Sunak signed a new long-term agreement covering defence and technology. The deal covers improved military cooperation between the UK and South Korea, focused primarily on countering smuggling in the East China Sea. That's your latest news headlines. We're on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Today, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, delivered His Majesty's Government's autumn statement. Inflation is lower and the economy is growing. I welcome much of what has happened today. It's good news for those of us who like a drink, as the duty on alcohol is frozen, particularly cider from Somerset, where the best cider comes from. And tax cuts are always welcome to Conservatives. Even the Socialists don't mind occasionally. However, it's not enough, really, because what we need is a smaller state. We are being taxed too much, and we need lower taxes But we can't do that without less government spending. I discussed this last night about where there are savings to be made, and we need to be putting that into practice. One of the biggest headlines from today is about tax cuts announced by the government. But are they all that they seem? Because in spite of the talk of tax cuts, tax as a percentage of GDP is going up. Now, this is because of fiscal drag. Fiscal drag is because of inflation. So that if you've got 10% inflation and the threshold for the higher rate is £50,000, it needs to go to £55,000 for you to remain in real terms the same as you were the year before. Now, if you get a £5,000 pay increase from 50 to 55,000, you are £1,000 a year worse off in real terms because of fiscal drag. And that means that the taxman is taking more of the economy. And this was explained in the ABR's Fiscal Outlook today, where they stated that although the autumn statement will reduce the tax burden by 0.7% of GDP, it still rises every year to a post-war high of 37.7% by 2028-29, the post-war high. The 0.7% is a reduction on where we would otherwise have been, rather than, in that sense, an absolute reduction. But these measures today and the future forecasts, which we've heard politicians talk about, are based on OBR forecasts. But the OBR is always wrong. It has one of the worst track records of any forecaster. It gets its figures wrong again and again. And this time, the reason there's £27 billion extra is because it underestimated the strength of the public finances. And this is a real problem, because the undemocratic, non-elected Quango, the Office for Budget Responsibility, through its underestimations, 3% underestimation of GDP from its March forecast, is taking control of how the economy is run. And this is very unfortunate, because it's politicians who need to be making these decisions, because we're accountable. We can be thrown out if we get it wrong. The OBR can't. And politicians have basically handed too much power to Quangos, when what we need is judgment. That's what former chancellors had. They would look at the forecast and then they would make a judgment on what they saw as to whether it was right or wrong. And the COVID inquiry is showing this, isn't it? That when you listen to the scientists and the modelers, they say things may happen, but they don't know for certain. And the people who are held accountable by voters are quite rightly politicians. As so often, it's Margaret Thatcher who got it right when she said, "Advisers advise and ministers decide. Ministers must not be usurped by Quangos." Of course, I want to hear from you. mailmog@gbnews.com. We must be now going to the channel. There's a very confusing teleprompting giving me the wrong messages there at the moment. But I've got with me two absolutely brilliant commentators, Bill Rammell, who was a former minister under Tony Blair, and Kwasi Kwarteng, who you will all know because he's a regular commentator on GB News and a very distinguished former Chancellor of the Exchequer. But, Bill, I'll go to you first, because you were in office when Gordon Brown was Chancellor and then Prime Minister. He wasn't tied in by the OBR, so he could actually apply his judgment to making decisions. Do you think that's a better way of doing it?
No, well, of course, the OBR was the creation of George Osborne and David Cameron. And I think you can make criticisms of it. But I think if you ask the general public, do they want the Bank of England, do they want the OBR to be driving in these decisions, or do they want the Chancellor to be setting the terms of reference? I think they'd choose the former. And, you know, I don't think today is a debate about the OBR. It's about the autumn statement. And I started off thinking, well, this is a bit of a damp squib. The longer it's gone on and the more detail that's come out, I think it's basically fraudulent. You know, if you take account of the freezing of the tax thresholds, even with the 2% reduction in NI, someone on £20,000 a year is going to be £250 worse off. And I think it's really dangerous for the government to be proclaiming tax cuts, but when people see their pay slips come the new year, they're going to realise they're worse off.
And Kwasi, Bill's got a very good point, hasn't he? That actually the headline is a cut in taxation, but you look through at the figures, and most people are going to have less money in real terms.
I think your point about fiscal drag and the thresholds is very well made, because clearly if you keep the threshold at 50,000 when inflation is at 10%, lots more people get to pay the higher rate, and that negates usually any tax cut that happens. But you will know that we're all playing the OBR game. I don't agree with Bill, because obviously one of the reasons I left office and was sacked was because of the OBR. The OBR predicted a 72 billion hole, which was then leaked. But of course, and I remember saying this to the Prime Minister, I said, because of fiscal drag, and it was clear inflation was high, I said that figure was very much likely to collapse in the spring, which it did. But of course, one panicked and one saw difficulties in the markets, and what happened. I think the autumn statement, and I agree with you, I think it is a step in the right direction. I've actually written a piece in the Telegraph about it. I do believe that the Prime Minister has said he's a tax cutter, and actually this was the first time that any taxes really have been cut under Rishi Sunak's tenure as the Chancellor and as Prime Minister. So I think that's a step in the right direction.
And Bill, to your point on the OBR, surely we do want the Chancellor to make these policies because he's the one who's elected, and if people don't like it, they can chuck him out. But if the power is with the OBR and the Bank of England, does it make any difference whether it's Jeremy Hunt or Rachel Reeves who is in charge?
I think it does, but in a sense, your homework is being checked by the OBR.
But the OBR always get it wrong. Sorry to interrupt, but their record is appalling.
Yeah, but you need someone to verify the claims that are being made by the politicians. And I think one of the other striking features in this autumn statement, according to the OBR, and I think they're right, is that the growth forecasts have been significantly downgraded. We're now looking at growth of an average of 1.3% over the next 3 years.
Why did you take any notice of that when the OBR last year said we were going to have a recession? This is the incompetent OBR once again making forecasts that there's a very good chance won't be true. I mean, if they are right, it's like the monkeys writing Shakespeare, isn't it? That you're right occasionally if you have infinite time.
But there's external commentators and analysts making similar claims about the projections that even after the autumn statement, growth is going down.
But I asked the Chancellor about this in response to his statement, and the answer he gave when I said, well, the OBR is useless, he said, well, yes, they are, but so's the Bank of England and the IMF and all these other forecasts.
And the public would say so's the government.
Well, that's a party political point.
But actually, your point about democracy is really important. And I know Bill thinks it does make a difference, but it doesn't. If you've got the OBR, for whom nobody has voted, and you've got the Bank of England, again, for whom nobody has voted, if they are the ones driving policy, it makes not a jot of difference whether you have a Conservative Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, myself, Rachel Reeves, whoever. Then it does, I'm afraid, become a bit of a pantomime if these unelected bodies are essentially the ones driving policy.
And there's no judgment to it, is it? That it becomes a formulaic process, that the OBR tells you what room you've got for manoeuvre, you move things about a bit.
That's right.
But Nigel Lawson, who, in my view, is one of the great chancellors...
we all respect him.
Didn't do that.
No, they didn't. They had much wider range. But actually, it's unfair, I think, to pick on the OBR. If you look across policy, I mean, the department that we both headed, Bayes, all these departments are constrained in a way by things like judicial review, all sorts of worthy things, quangos, non-elected bodies. They're constrained in a way that 30, 40 years ago just didn't happen. So across the piece, politicians have ceded, as you say, more power to unelected quangos.
And we've got a quotation from Rachel Reeves, apparently, that we can show on tax cuts, which I think would be interesting to hear from the Shadow Chancellor.
In response to last year's autumn statement, I warned that the government was pickpocketing working people through stealth taxes. I have long argued that taxes on working people are too high. Indeed, I said in my conference speech that I want them to be lower. From their failure to uprate income tax or national insurance bans, to forcing councils to raise council tax, the Conservatives have pushed the costs of their failure onto others.
So, Bill, what would Rachel Reeves cut to pay for reversing fiscal drag? I'm all in favour of reversing fiscal drag, but I'm also in favour of shrinking the size of the state and having some spending cuts. But Rachel Reeves seems to be in favour of maintaining spending, indeed 28 billion of extra spending on some things, whilst also reversing fiscal drag. How does that add up?
Well, she's not committing to reversing fiscal drag today.
That's what she was saying, though. She was saying these dreadful Tories, they're taking money out of the pockets of working people. That surely implies she wants to do something about it.
She's pointing out where this government has gone wrong. But we're going to inherit a dreadful fiscal inheritance, and we're going to have to proceed slowly. But, I mean, you know, one of the other features of the autumn statement today is the impact on public services. You look at the details. From 2025, there's just a real terms increase of 0.9% in public service spending. If you bear in mind, hospitals and schools are probably going to get the lion's share of that. You're talking about massive cuts in other areas of public spending. And I don't think the public want that or will wear it.
But dare I say this is the Labour Party fallacy, that just giving more money to public services makes them better, which isn't true.
Well, do you know what? When we were in power, waiting lists in the health service, because we invested, were down to 18 weeks. School standards went up because of massive investment. You need investment and reform.
Actually, school standards is one thing the Conservatives can do.
Yes, I think Michael Gove did an extremely good job. But this goes to the heart of our problem and the heart of Labour's problem, when, if, God forbid, they should win the election. Everyone wants more money to be spent, but we're growing at 1%. So it doesn't take an Einstein to work out if your public spending is going at 3, 4, 5%, and your real economy is growing up at 1%, you've either got to raise taxes or you've got to borrow more money and then raise taxes in the future. And that's the problem. That's the essential problem of the British state that we're going to have to solve as a country.
But that cuts to the heart of the choice that the British people will face at the general election. It is about growth. That's the key determinant. And don't judge politicians by what they say. Judge them by what they do. 1.5% average growth under 13 years of the Conservatives, average 2% under 13 years of Labour.
That's we left you a golden inheritance. But
that's right.
That's 150 billion.
has finished us off with Ricardian equivalence, which is a brilliant point on which to end. Ricardian equivalence, spending by borrowing and spending by taxation is exactly the same because voters aren't stupid. They know that borrowing is later on taxation, and therefore it has the same economic effect. It's a very important concept. So thank you to my panel, to Kwasi Kwarteng and to Bill Rammell. Coming up, in the biggest breakthrough since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, the 4-day ceasefire begins tomorrow. But what will the consequences be? And don't forget a wokerati plague on words.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GBNews.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Acquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new t-shirt. It's your new t-shirt.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing one of the biggest stories of the day, the autumn statement. Do the Chancellor's tax plans cut the mustard? And you've been sending in your views. Christina, failure to unfreeze the personal allowance and lower income tax will cost the Conservatives the next election. So I think Christina thinks it doesn't cut the mustard. And Claire, great programme, but please talk about people at the bottom of income scales as regards fiscal drag. They're really suffering, and no doubt many voted Tory at the last election because of Brexit. That's absolutely true, though, of course, the threshold was put up massively by the coalition government. So that was a very important fact of the early years, 2010 to 15. So today, we learned of a significant development in the Israel-Gaza war, whereby a 4-day humanitarian pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas is to begin tomorrow at 10 a.m. local time to allow the release of hostages. Following statements from the Israeli government and Hamas, 50 Israeli women and children be released, 150 Palestinian women and people under the age of 19 are to be released. Humanitarian relief will be allowed into Gaza, and for every additional 10 hostages released after that, there will be another day of pause in the fighting. This seems a positive turn since the attacks on the 17th of October. Experts, Israelis and Palestinians alike, are all conscious of what this could mean after the 4-day pause, with both sides saying they will continue with their efforts. Well, first this evening to discuss an extraordinary situation, I'm really privileged to be joined by a survivor from the Entebbe hostage raid of 1976, Benny Davidson, live from northern Israel. Mr. Davidson, thank you so much for joining me. You were 13 at the time when you were taken hostage. What was it like, and what was it like being rescued, which must have been a very frightening time?
Thank you for having me, and good evening, sir. It was frightening. Naturally, especially the first minutes of the hijacking of the airplane after we took off from Athens en route to Paris. But at the same time, the same frightening moments where all hell broke loose in the airplane, my parents took control of the situation as much as they could, and gave a couple of short commands that portrayed to me and my older brother, Ron, that even though you cannot take control of the situation, to some extent you can. And that prolonged with us through that whole horrible week in Entebbe until on Saturday noontime. I told a friend of mine, you'll see tonight at midnight, the IDF will come. I just had an enlightenment or a vision. He thought I was hallucinating, and we all know what happened, or what transpired. A very brave, extremely dangerous operation led by Yoni Netanyahu and the rest of the commando teams of Israel, who rescued all of us. Regretfully, we had 5 fatal people who died in there, including Yoni Netanyahu, and 4 hostages, but most of us got healthy and safely home. And regretfully, there is not much to compare to the current situation in Gaza, not in numbers, not in the location, not in the identification of the terrorists. I don't even want to call them terrorists because they're monsters. The one who hijacked us were terrorists. Those are simply monsters doing horrific, inhuman crimes against humanity.
Indeed. And from your experience, you've made lifelong friendships. You still know some of the people you were taken hostage with, and it's been very important to you from your age of 13 all the way on.
Yeah, I just talked earlier today with Tzipi, a good friend of mine. She lost her father there in the Entebbe operation, and we have a WhatsApp group of the kids of Entebbe. We still communicate and socialize and meet with Serene Hershko, one of the paratroopers who got very seriously injured and became paraplegic ever since. So yes, we stay in contact and we're good friends, and we spend time together, especially in these days.
Well, yes, and you have some understanding of what's going on in this terrible circumstance. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. With me now is Assistant Professor at King's College and Senior Lecturer in the School of Security, Dr. Andreas Krieg. Thank you so much for coming in. What do you think this means? Is it likely to turn into a longer ceasefire? What are the grounds for optimism, if any?
Well, I'm fairly optimistic. I mean, we're in very, very dark days here, and I think it's the very first step. I think there is a momentum here where the Israelis are realizing domestically, unfortunately, unlike in Entebbe, there isn't really a military way to get all these hostages out. I mean, you need to look at this massive tunnel system, which is very deeply embedded under Gaza, and there's no way no commander will actually go in there and actually get them out alive. So diplomacy is the only way forward. And I think it's a deal that obviously drip by drip, Hamas will demand more ceasefire pauses, and in return they will give up some of their hostages. I think it's a good way of building trust between both sides. I think the Qataris have made amazing progress in that respect and kind of bringing the two sides together. But the momentum could be used to build something bigger than just the hostage deal and potentially look for a day after this war, because nobody's actually talked about what will come after the military operation.
And the Qataris have played a very important role, haven't they? I mean, they're obviously close friends and allies of the UK government, but they have deep connections with the Palestinians as well, and they've been the key brokers to this.
Absolutely. So Qatar is obviously a tiny state, 350,000 inhabitants, very close ally of the UK, but it's a country that's kind of wedged between various rivals in the region, and for them to stay relevant, they had to build relationship with states and non-state actors and trying to offer these relationships to bigger and greater powers like the UK. And the UK government has been very much in contact with the Qataris to get UK citizens out, because there are, from what I understand, there are hostages in Gaza that are held by Hamas, which are British citizens. And Qatar has these relationships. They can speak to Iran, they're speaking to Hamas, they're speaking to Hezbollah. And I think it's important that you have a neutral space between East and West that can do these sort of things.
Carrying out the sort of Swiss role.
Yeah.
But the worry from the Israeli point of view, indeed from the Allied point of view, is that Hamas will use this as an opportunity to regroup and to protect themselves from future attacks. How worried are you about that?
Not very. I understand the narrative. Certainly they will try to regroup, but let's also not forget that Gaza City is in complete envelopment. I mean, the IDF, the Israeli Armed Forces, have completely encircled Gaza City, where most of the Hamas fighters are. There's no way for Hamas fighters to get out. The idea that they would now rearm or build new arms or get resupplies is just not going to happen, because there's no way in, no way out, and the Israelis have very much full control over that. Certainly they can regroup, but let's also not forget the IDF is in a very comfortable situation. We had a similar deal 3 weeks ago that the Israeli government said we don't want to agree to, because they thought they could make more progress on the battlefield. The same deal has now been approved, with conscious that the IDF is in a comfortable position, and also conscious of what is public pressure domestically. There are lots of Israeli citizens who are now saying bring the hostages home no matter what.
And indeed, the hostage families have been making very strong political protests within Israel, and they seem to have quite a bit of support for that.
Absolutely. Also, what we need to understand here, obviously, Hamas, terrorist organization, very radical. On the other side, you have radical elements within the Netanyahu government as well, who've been also an obstacle to security services, to the IDF, and to the more moderate forces to actually come to an agreement early on. 3 weeks ago, as I said, we could have avoided a lot more killing had the Israelis made a commitment at the time, and now they finally made it.
And from the IDF's point of view, is the loss of momentum going to make it harder for them to go back, or is the surrounding of Hamas that you described a factor that means they can actually continue when they want to?
I think they can continue when they want to. Otherwise, operationally speaking, the IDF would have never really allowed this to happen. But we also should be quite mindful that, that the momentum in itself, I mean, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a global public opinion, global public attention. A lot of Western governments and allies of Israel also saying you need to be more conscious of how you apply force, be more considerate, more proportionate. And so there's a momentum building as well as we kind of decelerate this war, that with these pauses, potentially the IDF will kind of get into a phase where people are saying, actually, maybe you can't win this war militarily. Maybe there is a way to move forward through diplomacy.
And therefore this is potentially a small start. It's
Yes.
not the end, but it's, we hope, the cloud no bigger than a man's hand.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Andreas Krieg. Coming up, the latest net migration figures are due tomorrow, with rumours of record-breaking heights, though this may, of course, be spin, plus a plague on words from the academic wokerati trying to rewrite our history.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Can you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this remains State of the Nation. We've been discussing the breakthrough in the Israel-Hamas conflict, with the two sides agreeing to the release of 50 hostages in a 4-day truce. And what have you been saying? Well, Brenda says, I don't trust Hamas to stick to the deal. They've already proved they're willing to commit atrocities. Why wouldn't they do it again? Tomorrow, we're going to get the latest net migration figures. Now, we don't know the exact figures, obviously, because they're being released tomorrow, but reports predict the figure could be as low as 400,000, or as record-breakingly high as 700,000. Even at 400,000, that would mean 1 million in 2 years. What we do know is we have higher levels of foreign workers coming to the UK, with the government permitting them to bring their family members to set up home in Britain too. Foreign students have now been barred from bringing their dependents to the UK with them, and it's suggested that foreign health workers will be the next to face limitations of one family member to accompany them to this country. Now, Suella Braverman wanted to push for more radical restrictions on the number of dependents allowed, but we all know how that turned out. This evening, I'm joined by a transcendent panel of the zealous and exuberant historian and author, Dr. Tessa Dunlop, and the cantankerous former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Right, Kelvin, do you want to be cantankerous about this, that net migration into the many hundreds of thousands?
When you actually cut it down, for instance, Nigerian who have been offered health visas here, there was like 25,000, which I found an astonishing amount. But what was more amazing was that they brought with them 40,000 dependents, right? So then you look at India, where it was a similar number. It was a higher number of actual, and I think 47,000 dependents. Honestly, there's two aspects to this. Why on earth, what is wrong with our own country? Why can't we produce our own? And the other thing is, how many? And this is based on, it'll be nearer 700,000, by the way. I don't know where the 400,000 figure came in. These are enormous numbers, and they are massively a problem for the Conservative government, because the Conservative government, give old Rishi his due, every 5 minutes he's saying, I'm going to crack down the boats, I'm going to crack down the boats. Don't worry about the bloody boats. Look at what's happening at the airports.
But isn't that the point? That the boats are tiny. They're sort of 5 to 10% of this. All our focus is on boats, whereas this is a much bigger number, and the government could deal with it overnight. It doesn't involve human rights, it doesn't involve legislation, it's regulation. It's really straightforward. Why aren't we dealing with it?
Well, it's about the economy, stupid. And I don't want... That was not my expression originally.
I remember, but it was Bill Clinton.
Well said. Well remembered.
I think that we all have to own that the migration problem, as it's perceived, has ballooned, and it's also changed. If you look at last year's set of statistics, where gross migration was 1.5 million, 1 million of those were non-EU. Pedal back to before Brexit, and it would have been reversed, where the majority of your migration were EU. Now, I happen to be very tuned into Romania. I spend a lot of time there. My husband's Romanian, etc. Most of these guys, predominantly men, but often women too, would come over for a short spell, just pop across the continent. Maybe they were students looking to save a bit of money, hotbed in London, go back over there when their economy started growing. If you're coming from somewhere like India, you've got to future-proof a little more securely, because it costs an arm and a leg. It's a big decision. You've got to pay all your visa costs up front. You can't just flop over in a freedom of movement way. So I believe both of you, I'm flanked here by two Brexiteers, and I hate to put it at your feet, but the common tiger of migration was ridden as a political point-scoring exercise in Brexit, and actually what's come home to roost is larger migration numbers from further away, harder in some cases to assimilate, and more expensive. I park it at your doors.
No, I reject that argument. On the what I do accept is if we were still in the EU, we would not only have 700,000, we'd have another 300,000 coming in. We'd have 1 million. You know that's the case. We had open borders. People very nicely came in and came out, and it's not true about the Indians and the Nigerians not going back. You try and get a plane seat on Air India. It is impossible. Everybody is travelling all the time, so it's a fantastic line to have. So actually, what I can't understand is why we have to take any dependents. Why don't we just look upon it as these are short-term visas, they come in, they make some good money, and then they can go home or they can be extended? Why do we have to say we have to take somebody's kids or husbands or granddads or whatever they have to take? Why?
Because how many dependents did you have in your prime when you were, the breadwinner sitting at the top of the table? Children, wife, etc.
You can send the money back. You don't have to have the person sitting around the table. That's the way a lot of people live already.
A lot of migrant workers send money back. And actually, it's really interesting. It was in the government's report on overseas aid that migrant workers sending money back is much bigger than global overseas aid. It's a really important economic benefit for the countries they're coming from.
And again, I go back to Eastern Europe. There was actually a social crisis in the early 2000s because so many mothers and fathers left their children, often in the care of one old grandparent. Kids weren't turning up to school. It was called the lost generation. And actually, I don't think that's necessarily something that we want to encourage. And as soon as they didn't have to do that, they stopped doing it. They either brought their children over eventually or they returned to their host country.
Surely it's not our... I don't want to sound too hard-hearted, or actually, on reflection...
It's all right. Lean into your stereotype.
I do. But why is that our problem. We're giving them secure, big money, stuff they couldn't earn elsewhere because otherwise they wouldn't have come, right? On top of that, we're saying, well, actually, I'll tell you what, bring in as many as you like in. Why don't we just say we have good jobs, secure jobs? I'm afraid you have to come and do it yourself.
And why are we allowing them to undercut our wages? Because they're putting it up to £30,000, whereas average wage is £35,000, and there's the 20% discount that they're allowed to pay in shortage occupations. So we're undercutting our own workers.
Let's just focus, first of all, on the question of why. Let's look at one of the biggest holes in our jobs market at the moment. The last time I checked, 165,000 vacancies in social care. Old people needing to be looked after. In a moment, you're going to be in that camp, needing people to look after you.
No, I'm not.
That is the reality of going over the age of 85.
I am in the fortunate position of going to the GB rest home, where there is no shortage of people who are going to look after me.
Who's going to man a woman at home?
I'm not against any nationality looking after me or looking after my family, right? But what I don't want to do is I don't want to bring in tens of thousands of other people.
It's a competitive market.
Yes, but Tessa, we've got millions of people in this country who aren't actually in employment, who could be in employment. And part of the reason is actually we're not paying people enough in social care. That's why we're getting them in from abroad at a discount to the going rate for the UK.
OK, well, then that's a political problem. And I would be all for people working in social care to be better unionised. They're horrifically
I don't want them unionised. That's a good point. I'm afraid I was being told I had to end anyway, so once we get into unionisation, thank you to my panel. Coming up next, academics. Well, some academics are suggesting the plague was racist. Why are they trying to rewrite history?
On Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, Tory heavyweight and former Home Secretary Priti Patel joins me live to give her exclusive reaction to today's autumn budget. Do you feel better off? Priti won't be pulling her punches. Plus, was Lorraine Kelly out of order for body shaming our jungle hero Nigel Farage? The one and only Kim Woodburn bites back. And should we ban sex work in the UK? Also, tune in to the most exciting paper review anywhere on the telly. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11. Be there.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle.
Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg in this State of the Nation. Now, in news that may drive you round the twist, car manufacturers Toyota, the car in front is a Toyota, have had 2 flagship television adverts banned in the UK as the advertisement's off-road driving footage triggers environmental concerns. Boasting the phrase "born to roam," eco-warriors have raised their agitation over lack of concern for the environmental impact. Toyota have clarified that the production was filmed legally on private land in Slovenia and that the narrative is sufficiently fantastical so as not to entice anyone to engage in such motor practices. So is the decision to ban the advertisement a legitimate response to concerns for personal environmental safety, or is it another frightfully boring bureaucracy, the Advertising Standards Authority, being silly old stuff shirts who we don't want taken notice of? Well, I've got my panel with me, Tessa Dunlop and Kelvin McKenzie. Tessa, this is so boring, isn't it, when petty-fogging bureaucrats ban an advert that's a bit of fun?
But is it fun? I mean, this is the week that Top Gear's finally come off air, and I wonder if the era of the petrol heads is finally coming to an end. And that would be a disaster for the mainstream media, because cars are massive advertisers. But actually, the caption is "born to roam" on these SUVs, these Toyota SUVs, nature's true spectacle. I mean, actually, who would let one of those vehicles loose on an off-road piece of terrain? And secondly, the deep irony is 3/4 of those who buy SUVs, where do they live?
They live next door to me.
In the cities.
But aren't people allowed to have a dream?
Yeah,
they would like to do this.
This is the problem. Tesla would probably ban these Porsche Cayennes and all these really big... Look, a lot of people, I'm not one of them, but a lot of people love a big car. The SUVs, and of course, the old eco-nutters are always pointing out that it's the SUVs in the south which are actually going to kill everybody in the north because they haven't got any.
But isn't it also, can't we have a bit of fun? I mean, things like Guinness is good for you, all those adverts in the 80s and 90s, the Hamlet adverts, which were so jolly and entertaining, the Smith's beer adverts, they were just iconically fun.
I think you have to be slightly careful to go down that line, because I can remember the menthol cigarette ads where somebody would say, there'd be somebody having a puff on a fag and somebody would say, "just like a mountain stream."
But I also think of tunes, menthol medicated, help you breathe more easily, as the man was asking for a ticket to Dottingham.
Kelvin makes a salient point, and I rarely say that.
Exactly.
What?
Because actually, people are going to look back at conversations like this one and just feel thoroughly misled. Climate change is not fun, it's killing people. I know it's boring for me to have to remind you that even
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. The ASA, just in their defence, have just banned, right, and criticised for misleading the ULEZ ads, which claimed this, that and the other, without actually pointing out that there weren't any facts to support it. It was an extension of one number, right? So although I'm hostile to this one from the ASA, I would congratulate them for the fact that they finally put Khan to the sword on this. Now, they're all aggravated and they claim that they're going to appeal. So some adverts are wrong. This one here is just a piece of fun. The guy explains...
We're going to have to move on, but can't we have...
social responsibility.
The Hamlet adverts. I want the Hamlet adverts brought back. They were such fun. That was the acme of amusing adverts.
Is that the Hamlet cigars?
The mild cigar from Benson and Hedges. And you'd have... They were so funny. And the man turning up in fancy dress when it wasn't a fancy dress party, and then they were brilliant.
But Jacob, lung cancer isn't fun. It's not fun.
Anyway, we better move on to British academia, which is yet again plaguing us with bizarre hypotheses in order to further the narrative that Britain is a racist and evil nation. The latest addition to the myriad accusations of British bigotry, so-called experts are now telling us that black people may have fared disproportionate fatalities from the Black Death, which crippled the nation between 1348 to 1353. Researchers of black feminist ideology making these claims have suggested critical race theory should be applied to archaeological research. But they clearly forgot Joan of England, the King's favourite daughter, that's King Edward III's favourite daughter, of whom he wrote, "With what intense bitterness of heart we have to tell you this destructive death, who seizes young and old alike, sparing no one, and reducing rich and poor to the same level, has lamentably snatched from both of us our dearest daughter, whom we loved best of all as her virtues demanded." It affected rich and poor alike. So is there any point in this attempt to rewrite history? And I think Edward III was really very fond of his daughter Joan in a way that medieval monarchs weren't expected to be. And the Black Death hit everybody.
Indeed, but do you remember at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a spike in the numbers of those in ethnic minority populations and groupings who contracted and died of the virus in the first wave, and they worked out that was because, of course, high numbers of those individuals worked on the frontline services in the NHS, etc. So it didn't mean that the virus was inherently racist, but the nature of society and the way in which we group ourselves and socio-economic relations meant that some people were more vulnerable. It's OK to own that and to look for trends and patterns in history, a history that's previously and still is predominantly written
this is
through
based on
quill of a white man.
This is based on very limited evidence.
Yes, and the question is, I don't know, perhaps your viewers know, perhaps even Tessa.
Dr. Tessa might know.
She seems to know everything. How many, what is the percentage of black people during that period? And what was the answer to that?
Interestingly, that was a question that I wanted the answer to, and the article didn't get to the bottom of it, but they reckon that
But you're an academic. I'm surprised you didn't research it before you came on, Tessa.
Indeed, I did. There were time limits, and I was trying to get my head around the autumn budget and the migration figures, but I did my best on critical race theory, which is really just an inversion of what we've put up with for millennia, which is always looking at the way history and its cause and effects impacts on the white man. It's flipping it around. Sometimes the pendulum swings a bit far and it makes you upset, but in the end, it's by getting a rounded view.
It's just nonsense. The Black Death killed everybody. It's thought that the population of London could have gone down from 100,000 to 20,000.
Yeah.
And that's an enormous death rate of everybody.
But perhaps black women, depending where they were working and what they were doing, were more susceptible, like black people in Britain in the first wave of COVID.
When it's hitting 80% of people, it's very unlikely to be discriminating on this basis. And how many were there in England, in London, at that point? There were some traders. But probably not huge numbers.
And probably if the disease is coming in through ports, then they are more susceptible because they're in the front line again.
Well, but the real issue is, were there many, right? And the interesting aspect is, at what point and what jobs did they do in London? And none of that is covered in there. So it would be fantastic. They're having a guess, and they're getting some good publicity for that, because all these academics, as you well know, Tessa, are constantly coming up with bizarre ideas for theses so that they get them funded. And this is another one.
I agree. Everything has to intersect these days. Do you know what intersectionality is?
I have no idea.
Well, for example, you wouldn't count because you're both white and male. I have one aspect, I'm female, but if I was black and female, I've got both my gender and my race intersecting. And they reckon that...
To your advantage or your disadvantage?
Well, why don't you identify as something different, and then you'll all be fine. But unfortunately, we've got to move on. Thank you to my panel. We'll be seeing them both again next week. That's all from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. What's on your bill of fare tonight, Patrick?
Well, I am trying to liven it up after Jeremy from Accounts put the nation into a coma earlier on with his autumn statement. Priti Patel will be giving her unvarnished view. The clash is on whether or not Lorraine Kelly has body-shamed Nigel Farage. Should we ban sex work because Germany's doing it? They think they're now the brothel of Europe, and we don't want to go that way, do we? So we're talking about all of that. And stay tuned, because at 10, I take you down under for all the latest on another explosive day in the jungle. You will not want to miss it.
Well, that'll be very exciting. I'm not sure I know what body shaming is. I think if you wear a double-breasted suit, you can't be body shamed. And Priti Patel is a great heroine of conservatism, a true blue Tory. So you will we'll have a very good conversation with her. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jake Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and the sun is definitely shining in Somerset because the tax on cider hasn't gone up. So we rejoice and bask in sunshine as we do almost every day, even in the winter.
Good evening, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. The wind's picking up a bit tonight and tomorrow, particularly so across the north. Largely dry in the south tomorrow, but it's going to turn colder for all of us by Friday. Still got high pressure nearby to the southwest, but this cold front will be introducing the colder air as the isobars squeeze together. The wind's picking up. A very blustery night across northern Scotland, particularly so in the Northern Isles. Got a wet night for the Highlands, and that rain slowly edging south across the Western Isles. Further south, some patchy rain over the hills of southern Scotland.